What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, October 5th of 2021, the first day of the MLB playoffs, which is pretty exciting. We've got a Red Sox-Yankees showdown tonight with some decent-sized contests, so that is fun here, especially in the middle of the week when there's no football this time of year. We've got NHL kicking off. I guess kicking off isn't really the right word in that case. We've got NHL puck drop 2 weeks or a week from today, and we've got NBA tip-off 2 weeks from today. So I was just thinking earlier this morning, it is really probably the best month of the year for sports. So pretty excited to be here on Talking Today on this stream. If this is your first time watching this stream, thanks for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about this. I say this every single stream, but I do these shows live for a reason. I want questions from you guys. I want engagement from you guys. If you ask a question or you're just listening, following along, and something is confusing, you get a little lost when I'm walking through something, totally makes sense. I totally get it. Please ask your follow-up questions that you have for me in the YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel in Slack so I can help answer any questions you have. If you have thoughts or just your 2 cents to something that we're talking about, pop that into the chat. I know sometimes we get some pretty cool side conversations going on in the YouTube chat that I always like to follow along and read. I find those super interesting, but there's been certain times too where I'm answering a question or explaining some kind of concept and somebody pops into chat and explains it, I think, better than I was even doing it. I can just pull that message up on screen and read that. But we do have a few questions to get through today. Not the busiest day overall. So if you've got a question, these Tuesday and Wednesday shows during football season in particular, I think there's a lot of time to dig into some of these questions and answer a few other questions. So if you've got something you've been meaning to ask, it's a good day to pop it into the chat. But we've got a few questions about different contest sizes and entry limits and how we want to approach those kinds of contests. I think actually 3 different people messaged me in some capacity about the differences between 3 max, 20 max, 150 max, or 1,000 to 50,000 people contests, things like that. So we'll cover all of that. I see there's a question about entering lineups, actually getting your lineups out of SaberSim and into the sites using the CSVs, which you don't need to do. So we'll do a entry editor demo here today on stream as well. And then we will just tackle whatever questions we get from there. But before we go ahead and get started, a couple notes. So tomorrow we are going to be doing our strategy session for this week. It will be NFL themed. What we are going to do is a strategy session on basically how to get value out of other content that you might be consuming for NFL. If you're anything like me, there's articles and videos and podcasts and maybe things that you are interested in as the week is ramping up, approaching NFL Sunday, that you are then using to influence your process. We want to talk a little bit about how to judge whether the content that you are consuming is quality, how SaberSim may or may not agree with what you are getting out of that content, and then how to kind of impart your research into the process using SaberSim. So that will be tomorrow's strategy session. Then we will be back doing office hours on Thursday and Friday of this week. Next week is going to be a big NBA tip-off strategy session bonanza. Every day next week, we are going to be doing NBA content. So we're super excited about that. A lot of similar content we did to the first week of NFL. So we'll be talking about tackling GPPs, main slate GPPs for NBA. We'll be talking about showdowns, how to beat showdowns for NBA, cash games, contest selection and bankroll management. We'll probably have Matt and Will come on too, again, to talk about the NBA model and talk about how the NBA simulator works. So next week, big NBA focused week. Obviously, we'll still be around. I know NFL's going on. Heat of the season, we'll be around all week to answer NFL questions in Slack. And if there's NFL questions that come up towards the end of those streams, happy to talk about those. But with NBA right around the corner, it's a big sport. I know there's a lot of excitement about NBA. We'll be doing a big week of NBA content starting next week. So anyway, last item on housekeeping, we did do our giveaways yesterday for the weekly max challenge. So anybody that won on DraftKings should have already gotten an email. We'll make sure I get an email out to everybody that won on FanDuel here right at the end of the show. But we did do our giveaways yesterday. If you don't know about this, definitely recommend joining up on these contests and giveaways because they are very positive EV for you. Very easy to win some cool stuff. So all you need to do is have the SaberSim logo up on DraftKings or FanDuel. Max out either the 5-cent pooch punt on FanDuel for the Sunday main slate or the 50-cent mini max on DraftKings for the Sunday main slate. Send Andy at sabersim.com an email showing your screenshot that shows your avatar that you're in the right contest by 1 o'clock Eastern on Monday. And we'll enter you in to win a bunch of cool stuff. You get the opportunity to win just a giveaway, random selected giveaway to play the contest for free next week. But if you are the top finisher overall, you get tickets to some bigger contests, free SaberSim, private free rolls. And if you were to take one of these contests down, which we had a ton of people in the top 100 last week for the mini-max in particular. So I think somebody is getting close to taking this down. We will give you a cherry on top of your winnings for bringing the contest down anyway with some cash, free SaberSim, and then really excited to see what these custom championships or custom trophies, custom championship belt or custom trophies look like. So I just wanted to shout this out. Make sure that you guys are remembering this. I know these contests sometimes can start to fill up pretty early. I think by Tuesday, you're still totally fine. But I have seen that these contests have filled up sometimes by Saturday night or very early Sunday morning. So make sure you are getting into these early. Whew. That will do it, I think, for housekeeping, for announcements, for things like that. We can go ahead and start getting into questions. Again, I'm going to tackle these in roughly chronological order, in the order that they came in. But if you've got questions, go ahead and pop them into YouTube chat. I see Samuel's got a question here about mini stacks. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. But let's go ahead and get started here. So I wanted to start with a question here. Okay, cool. So this is a common question. I'm going to start with this one. This is from Underrated here. And then there's a bit of a follow-up question here on mechanics of entering contests. But he said, when building lineups for different contest sizes, do you create different builds for each size? For example, you enter your 3 single entry contests, a 20 max and a 150 max, all with a different number of entrants. All will have different slider settings, obviously, but how would you tackle this if you were pressed for time? Well, if you were pressed for time, I think you are totally fine. Let's go ahead and jump over to the NFL main slate because I think that's probably going to be a little bit more accurate. If you were pressed for time, and what I do in 95% of the slates I play is I just build them all together. The differences in the sliders they're going to have an impact, right, of the way that your build is run, but you are not going to have a enormous impact such that I would be concerned about building your builds on slightly different settings for the given contest. So I think there's a few options here. The easiest thing to do is to pick a midpoint contest that kind of matches up to approximately the middle of what you're looking for. So in this particular case, right, we've got 3 single entry contests. Let's assume that those are like this, right, between 1,000 and 10,000. And then at the top, you've probably got your 150 max, which is probably like this. A suitable middle point that I think would be just fine would be setting this to like a 20 max and some sliders like this, and just rolling with it and using this as your build. So in this particular case, it sounds like maybe you would have 173 total lineups, just as an example. If there were three single entries, a 20 max and a 150 max, so maybe you have 173, maybe you build a big pool of 1,500, and you go from there. The slider settings at this point are not going to create such massive changes in your lineup constructions that are going to make certain lineups negative EV for the contest they are going into. I think this is what I would recommend, especially given on this question, if you were pressed for time. The other component of this too is really where you are spending the time on your process. I spend a ton of time in step 3 editing my exposures, and that is something that I would prefer to do that just once in one single build that includes all of my lineups, because that's where I'm adding my value. If I was going to do 3 different builds, I would have to adjust exposures and dial everything in 3 different settings. If you relate a little bit more strongly to editing projections, or you spend a lot of your time dialing in projections, dialing in ownership, editing the team totals, and then more or less just kind of roll with what SaberSim gives you in step 3. I know there are players out there that are doing that. It may not take as much time for you to just run 3 separate builds since most of your work is being done on step 1 at each individual setting, but you're not going to add a ton of value to doing that. Differentiating your builds on each individual build setting. So Another way of deciding exactly what sliders you wanted to use if you were doing a combined build would be to do it based on a like kind of financial approach. So depending on what the contest limits or the depending on how much you were paying to enter these contests, right? You could pick the slider settings that were in line with where you were most invested. So if, for example, back to this 3 single entry contest, 20 max and a 150 max, let's say the single entry contest is like the $1, the $3, and the $5. So you have $9 in single entry contests, and the 20 max is the $1 first down or something like that. Just an example. So you have $20 in the 20 max, and the 150 max is the mini max. So it's 50 cents, $75 total to enter. Well, in that particular case, if you kind of think of a weighted approach, you have most of your money invested in the 150 max. So you could go in here and just say, okay, I'm just going to build using the 150 max settings. Or you could, again, kind of take a more weighted approach where maybe you say, I'm not going to just do straight up. I'm not just going to straight up do the 150 max settings, but I'm going to use manual mode and kind of pick a slider settings that are a little more weighted to the build in particular where I have my most money invested. But again, very difficult to mess this up if you are landing somewhere in the range of your smallest single entry to your largest 150 max. I think you're, as long as you're somewhere in that range, and if you're in, I would say in particular, being in the middle of that, like the sliders are going to be significant, are going to be similar enough that you're not going to get significant changes in your build outcomes. I guess one more point on this that I'll make is if you are ever torn, like really just unsure of what settings to put your sliders at because you're playing contests that are in between or a big range of contests, I would lean on the side of making these sliders higher than lower, right? If we overfade ownership slightly, I think it is better than us underfading ownership slightly. If our lineups are a little bit more contrarian for GPPs, right? I think it's better than being a little too chalky. Same with sim variance. If our lineups are a little bit more variant, have a little bit more diversity, have a little bit higher upside at the expense of their average performance, it's probably better for a GPP. Even correlation is probably true as well. This one can be a little tricky, but in general, we would rather our lineups be a little more correlated than a little less correlated for these contests. So I would say that's another good kind of tiebreaker there for you. But where I typically at least start to maybe where I a little bit start to kind of be a little concerned that my sliders are a little bit are at the point that they're so different from the contest that they might not be as positive expected value is when any given slider is 3 or more ticks off from where it should be. So for example, if you were playing this set of contests, right? So let's say there are some single entries here that are this 1,000 to 10,000, right? So you have 6, 1, and 4, and then your most extreme contest is the 150 max, right? This is 6, 4, 10. So it was, remind me again, 6, 1, 4, and 6, 4, 10. So in this particular case, it may make sense to pick kind of a midpoint value that can kind of satisfy both of these contests. So maybe it does make sense to bring ownership fade down a little bit and maybe bring sim variance down just a little bit, which is the effect you get of just picking kind of a midpoint contest, right? That's why I say to do that. That was why the first thing I said to do that. That's really where in just running, I've run builds at every single setting pretty much just to see what happens. It's a really good way to learn what the sliders are actually doing. And that is what I kind of noticed, just anecdotally speaking, is that you really start to actually see differences that seem fairly significant in the way the lineups are being built and what players are showing up and what their exposures are when your sliders are 3 or more different, 3 or more ticks up or down in either direction. So that's also another good line to look, but don't stress about that. That is the sliders in particular. I've spent probably about 10 minutes here on this question. And the 10-second answer is pick a midpoint value and let it rip, because it's not going to make a huge difference in how your lineups end up coming out. It's a lower value part of the process is the step 2. So with that said, I will move on because I definitely don't want to stress that this is something to obsess over. I just want to make sure answering this with all the detail here overall. So Underrated did have a little bit of follow-up here and said, I think the biggest difference I noticed is the smart diversity number. Usually number is bigger in the 150 versus single entry. Yeah, I think that's true. That is definitely where you're probably going to see the biggest swings. That is the slider that really moves the most between different slider settings too. So that makes sense. I guess the last note I will make on this is there is kind of a moderate approach here too with your builds that you can take. And I've experimented with this sometimes, which is just separating, rather than separating every single contest you're playing, group them into your single entries and 3 maxes and your 20 max and your 150 maxes. You're going to find that the single entries and 3 maxes stick very, very closely together with their recommended sliders. They are only very slightly different between these two. It's often very easy to group those together and do a build for your single entries and 3 maxes. And your 20 maxes and your 150 maxes are also likelier to stay a little bit closer together. So that is one option if you want to take a moderate approach where you're doing 2 different builds, but you're at least not doing 4 different builds or 3 different builds. You can do that. Group your single entries and 3 maxes together and group your 20 maxes and 150 maxes. The other reason why that can be useful, at least in my experience, is that if I'm just playing, let's say I'm playing 5 combined single entries and 3 maxes. So maybe it's 1 3 max contest and 2 single entries. A lot of times, while setting exposures for those contests can still be useful, sometimes I more like to have the approach of actually just going in and picking the individual lineups I want to play instead of setting an exposure, right? Like I could care less maybe if I'm playing 5 Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams stacks in my 5 single entries. I care more about if those are truly my favorite 5 lineups of the pool. So a lot of times I will actually go through in my single entry contest, do a separate build and just pick the individual lineups I want out and just save that set of lineups. Whereas with 20 maxes and 150 maxes, if you're playing 190 unique lineups or something like that, that's way too many lineups to, I don't know how I ended up in here. 190 lineups is way too many lineups to go pick individually. It makes more sense to edit via exposures. So I think that can also make some sense, is to just group those 2 together. So anyway, cool. Let's keep going. So next question, and this is a good one here. This was from Lundar about entering your contest. So he said, the mechanics of entering multiple MME tournaments. Like last night, I entered 2 20-entry tournaments. Wasn't sure how to use multiple CSVs effectively. So I just had the simulator create 40 lineups and then hand-selected each lineup, which I know can't be the best way, lol. I've reserved 3 20-entry tournaments and 1 150 entry for week 5. So it would be great to go over the best way to run multiple lineups, save them, and upload/enter them for each separate contest. Thanks. Sorry for the novel total noob here. No problem. So let's talk about this here. So there are a few different ways to handle this, and I'm going to jump over to the MLB Showdown for tonight because I have entered contests, at least a handful. I don't have NFL Sunday contests entered yet. So first of all, what you should always do first when you are when you're about to build your lineups is once you have reserved your entries on the site, is download them into the entry editor. So you really don't even need to get into the CSVs at all, as long as you're playing on FanDuel or DraftKings. Our entry editor will help you get all of your right lineups into the right contests, no matter what, right? So this is the first step. So if you're on DraftKings, what you do is you click entries here, right? This is going to take you to the entry editor. It's going to prompt you. Well, actually, I might have just... Hang on, let's go back. I don't think it liked me pressing. Okay, so it's going to take you here. You can click download template file from DraftKings, and it's going to immediately prompt you. You guys can't see this, but it's going to prompt you to download your entries file, and we can download it and then just simply drag it onto the entry editor, and it's going to pull them in. So you can see I'm just playing a couple of lineups, or 26 lineups or so. A lot of low stakes stuff tonight. This is actually, as far as I could tell, the only lineups or the only contests that were in the DraftKings lobby that fit our contest selection principles. So these all have 1,000 or more effective entrants. So, or are just free, which is this one. So that's what I'm playing, but I have 26 different lineups here. So Option one, and what we recommend for most players, is to just build a unique lineup for every contest you're playing. So what you would do in that particular case is you would do one single build, again, using the principles that we just talked about, kind of picking a midpoint value in terms of our sliders here. So maybe we pick something like this. That works. And we're going to set this equal to 26. And we are going to build 26 lineups. And we're going to just put a unique lineup into every single contest. So we'll let this build. And I probably don't need all 500 here, but maybe it'll give me a minute to build it. It's building pretty fast, so I'll take a minute and catch my breath here. But again, the main reason why we recommend people do this and do a unique lineup into every single contest is so that you give yourself as many opportunities to get a high-scoring lineup as possible, right? If you use duplicates between contests, right, that's fine. You're probably just getting additional action on those lineups. You're doubling down on those lineups, but you're reducing your overall probability of having a super high scoring lineup. So let's just assume here that we're mostly just pretty happy with these lineups. We're not going to make any edits. We're just going to take them as they are. We can go back to the entry editor and now click this fill contest with lineup button. And we're going to get a few options here. So first of all, we need to specify what set of lineups we want to use to fill. So in this case, we're taking the GPP 1220 build we just ran. We're taking the 26 set of lineups. And we're going to use the unique fill method. So what the unique fill method is going to do is it's going to, again, you pull a unique lineup and put a unique lineup into every single entry we have. The ranked fill method would use the first lineup as the first lineup into every contest. So it would fill the same lineup into this one, and this one, and it would be the first lineup into this one and this one. Then it would use the second and third lineups here and also fill those here in the 20 max, and then fill the next 17 lineups to fill out the 20 max, right? So it's doubling down on the highest Saber score lineups, but we want to use unique. So let's go ahead and use unique. We can just click apply. The exposures are all going to update here. We're going to see that it's pulling the right lineups here into all these contests, the right build. It has the fill method here. And now, very easy to just get these into the site. We click download all entries. I recommend just clicking download and open DraftKings because it's going to immediately take you to the right page. Again, you can't see this here, but I'm getting a pop-up that's prompting me to download my entries file. So I'm just going to save it. And now you can see it's saved up here. So now we click upload CSV, and I'm going to find that downloaded file and upload 26 entries. And I'm in. So I'm just good there. So that's the most basic way of doing this. Now, it seemed like in the original question, it's noted about the best way to run multiple lineups, save them, and upload and enter them for each separate contest. So again, this is the assumption that you're going to build all your lineups together. You're going to do a unique fill and proceed like that. But let's say, just for example, that you wanted to actually do this separately. And let's say that this build was actually going to be for the quarter jukebox only. So we could save this. You can actually even name this set of lineups here to make it a little bit easier and call this quarter jukebox so you can really see and keep a track, and then click this and save it. And now let's say we had one other set of lineups we wanted to run for our 3 max and single entries. So 6 other lineups. So we could go then and say 3 max, and this is 6. And we don't need 500 lineups for this one. So we're going to do a separate build, and this is going to be for our single entries and 3 maxes. And you can still use the entry editor to manage all this, but we're just going to do this in this particular case with different builds. Okay, so now, again, we'll just take the builds as they are, and we're going to rename this and call this single entry / 3 max. Rename. Okay, so now let's go back to the entry editor. And now what we're going to do is we're going to fill these differently. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to uncheck this at the top to deselect all. And we're going to click only the quarter jukebox. Click fill contest with lineups. And this time we're going to click quarter jukebox because that's the right fill here. And rank is fine because it matches up exactly. It's 20 lineups. And we're just going to apply it, right? So that's done. Now we want to fill our single entries. So we can click, or single entries and 3 maxes. So we can click the 3 max and the 3 single entries. Fill contest with lineups. Single entry and 3 max is correct, but we want unique because we want each of our 6 lineups, we want one of those to show up in each contest or each entry. So now we click apply. Okay. So now we're good. And we'll reselect the quarter jukebox here. So it's incorporated. So it's included in our pool. And again, just download entries. So now we can save that. And now we'll update here. And again, 26 entries. So Lundar, not sure if you are watching this here. Let me know if that was helpful or if that was helpful to anybody else. Again, you really don't need to get your hands dirty in the CSVs at all, whatsoever, pretty much. You shouldn't have to do that. That's the whole point of the entry editor. It makes managing this way easier. As long as you're playing FanDuel and DK. If you're playing Yahoo, the entry editor is not going to work. They have frankly, a pretty complicated implementation with their CSVs, and you download individual CSVs on a per contest basis. And if you're playing Yahoo, let me know, and we'll do a separate demo for Yahoo of how I recommend going through this. But that should be helpful for DraftKings. FanDuel is very similar, basically the same steps, just different pages on their site, obviously. But this should be way easier. This is by far the easiest way to get your lineups off of SaberSim and into the sites. Really the easiest way to get your lineups off of any tool out there and into the sites. So definitely recommend getting familiar with this and using this every single day. So Lundar said he is here. Probably have to watch this back a couple times as you enter them, but very helpful. Play almost 100% DK. Yeah, good. So I'm glad this was helpful. The one other thing I'll note is that this whole entry editor section is pretty full of a bunch of different tutorial videos. So I've recorded a separate video doing basically the exact same thing. If you click this video, how to save hours a week, this is just kind of a different version of exactly what I just walked through. And then in the actual entry editor itself, there are other tooltip videos talking about kind of each individual section. So the fill methods are talked about in more detail in this video up by the fill methods thing. The swap tools are talked about in more detail in this video. And using the download button to get your lineups onto the right sites and things like that is in this video. So there are other tools here as well. So awesome. Cool. Okay, so quick question. This came in from Tom in Slack. I'm going to hit this. I think this is the last question I have on Slack. And he said, just wonder if you have any idea why the SaberSim avatar will not replace my avatar on my tournaments. I've been trying for a week now. I have it on my computer and all working, but on my phone, it will not go to the DK app. Any idea so I can support SaberSim? I had my best win last night. It would be nice to support you all. Yeah, we appreciate that. I think there's just some latency issues with the avatars updating on the DraftKings app. One thing it might be worth trying is just logging out and logging back in on the app and seeing if it updates. You could also try to uninstall and reinstall the app and see if it updates. If it's showing on your computer, it makes me think that it's just a weird lag on the app. Otherwise, if those two things don't work, it's a little bit out of our sphere of influence here, and I would probably send DK an email and ask them what's going on there. But I would try those two things first. So I know mine had a little bit of trouble updating ages ago when I updated it to SaberSim. And I think I either logged out. Yeah, Cody said that he had the same issue and he logged out and logged back in and that fixed it. So I think that might be the easiest thing to do. So okay, cool. Let's go ahead and jump back up. I'll hit these questions in YouTube chat. I think there were a few short little questions that came in through support as well. We'll get to everything, but let me hit these questions here that came in from Slack. So first of all, Samuel said, how can we first our second mini stacks more into all the lineups? Good question. Let me see. We'll get into that. I want to see your other questions here and see. So also said, I know I've asked in the Slack chat, but I'm having issues saving my stacking rules and done them both ways. Do main tab first and then stacking and vice versa. And I even tried to save them while under stack. I've even tried saving each way back and forth, but as soon as I refresh the page or move from DK to FanDuel or vice versa and try to load the settings, I get the main, but not the stacking. Thanks. Okay. So this is possibly a bug here. Let's test it real quick. That sounds like a bug. So let's look. So let's say, We're playing big 150 max, and we want to... Okay, so let's say we want to do QB plus 2 pass catchers as just an idea, plus a run back player. Just, okay. Yeah, we'll call this QB plus 2, 1. Okay. So now let's save this and say that these are our main 150 max GPP. Okay. All right. So now if we move things around here, let's see. Let's do it like this, actually. I haven't experimented too much with this. So the like saving rules, I don't know why. I'm kind of lazy and I've just, well, maybe it's not lazy. I don't know. I've always just reset my rules every time. But okay, so main 150 max GPP. Okay, so yeah, it doesn't look like, oh no, there it is. So let me see if I can follow this a little more specifically. So, okay, so the move to DK or FanDuel, I am pretty sure that settings are going to be specific for a site. I'm not positive that you can just switch, like, I don't even know. Can you just switch site settings and have this pull over? I'm not even sure if that is intended to work that way. So like okay, so yeah, between sites, you're going to have 2 different sets of build settings for FanDuel and DraftKings. But let's see now if I go back to DK and see if it also works again here. So it's still, let's go like this. And now let's load again. Okay, so now it's gone. So it does seem like there are some issues with that stack rule totally persisting. So I will figure out what's going on there. I think the very first step is I just need to verify that this actually is intended to work that way, because I'm not positive. Like it should. We definitely want you guys to have the ability to save your stacking rules so you don't have to reset them every time. But I don't even know if that was actually like necessarily intended functionality when we put this new stacking rule together. So I'll follow up there and see what's going on. But let's go ahead and talk back more about this first question. How can we force our second mini stacks more into all of the lineups? So, I mean, you really kind of have 2 options here of either setting them into 100% of the lineups or not, right? So let me say what I mean. So I think like the first option is you set an advanced stacking rule. And if you set an advanced stacking rule, you can force it to show up in 100% of your lineup. So let's say your rule, right? I think the very common rule that I see is people that want to do something resembling this, right? Where they have 1, 2 pass catchers. And let's just assume it's just a wide receiver and tight end. And then there's typically some run back player, but a lot of times I think it's a wide receiver, right? And then there's some other rule that you want to do as your mini stack, right? So if you set this rule here and say that of the remaining players in the lineup, one of the running back, wide receivers, or tight ends remaining must be playing basically in the same game as another wide receiver or tight end on the other side. Running backs are often negatively correlated with each other on opposing teams. So this is the way I think the rule I see most often is set. Now, setting a rule like this. So again, this is our QB plus 2. And this is our mini game stack. So setting the rule like this is going to make sure this shows up in 100% of your lineups. So let's see. I saw a follow-up question here. So Samuel said, also, should I remove all the teams and just select the ones I want to? But what about their bring back team? Do they also need to be all selected as well? Thanks. No. So you can't even actually select the bring back team. So you can only select the team. So if you wanted to only include a certain number of other teams, right? You can just, I guess I get what you're saying. Do you need to select the team plus the bring back? Like if you select Green Bay, do you need to select Cincinnati too. It kind of depends on the way the rule's written, right? So like if you just do Green Bay here, Aaron Jones could theoretically show up and satisfy this stack with Tyler Boyd on the other side or something. If you include, but the other way around, Joe Mixon could not show up here and be matched with Devontae Adams. So it like probably does make sense for you to include both sides of the game that you want here if you are selecting only certain games to show up here. So like Detroit, Minnesota, and maybe New Orleans and Washington. Right. So it kind of depends again on what your actual rule is and what you are trying to get out of it. But these teams here will match up to the exact eligible positions that are shown here. And on the opposing team, will match up to these. So it just depends on what you are comfortable with in your actual rule being set. But anyway, this will allow you to, this will put it into 100% of your lineup. So now if we go back here, let's just do 20 and let's just build a pool of 100 so it's a little bit faster. But we are going to see here now, we'll see that QB +2 with a one wide receiver run back and then a matching other position player with an other position player in the game stack in 100% of lineups. So if you want this to show up in 100% of lineups, the advanced stacking tools are the easiest way to do it. That's what I would recommend. So we'll let this build for a second just so we can see it. Now, the original question here says, how can we get these more into lineups? And that's really where it starts to get tricky. If you don't want this in 100% of lineups, there is not really an easy way to edit your exposures or something like that to say, I want these mini stacks showing up in 50% of lineups or something like that. Your options really are either to set the explicit stacking rule, right? That forces them. So we can see here, right? Burrow, Boyd, Chase, Adams run back, and Austin Hooper and Keenan Allen have the opposing mini game stack. Here, Burrow, Chase, Boyd, Adams again. In this particular case, it is Leonard Fournette and Mike Gesicki, right? Because again, the way we wrote the rule, those kinds of things can correlate. You could do it with just additional wide receivers if you wanted, but whatever. Anyway, my point being, if you want to, let's just go back to this build, whatever this is. This is just default settings without a stacking rule. If you wanted to just kind of like force more lineups to show up with that without forcing it in 100% of lineups, it does start to get a little tricky. It's difficult to do. I wonder if this had a stacking rule too, because I'm noticing there's that correlation is showing up here as well. Oh, no. Anyway, those players are going to show up, like these kinds of mini game stacks are going to show up naturally in builds because of the correlation of these players anyway, right? Cooper has a small correlation with Ingram, so it's going to be emphasized in builds because of the correlation slider. But beyond setting an advanced stacking rule to get it into 100% of your lineups, there's not an easier way to get it into just more of your lineups in step 3. I could see definitely how in the future it might be more useful to just have another way of viewing stacks. Right now, stacks are defined really in this page as including the QB. But I could see how it would be useful in the future to be able to go in here and say, like, show me mini stacks that don't include the QB and then increase the exposure to them. But at the moment, there's not a very easy way of doing that. So, but hopefully that was helpful for now. I will go, I'll figure out exactly here with the team, the best way to handle the saving the stack rules thing. And we'll get that fixed, because I can definitely see getting a little bit tedious here as you have to do that every single week, really for almost every single build or anytime you change anything. So, let's see. So Cody said, a little off topic, but while we're on the subject of MLB Showdown, a very relevant topic for tonight. Do you have any positions you like to focus on for the captain spot? I imagine the Sims would favor pitcher. While this question is up, I did want to call out, and I was actually just going to post this into the MLB channel here as soon as I hop off, just so people know that this is here. But we did do a strategy session earlier this season. So on our YouTube channel under strategy sessions, it is now all the way to the right. But Chris came on here with me and we did this how to beat MLB DFS Showdown contest. And we did it for, funny enough, a Red Sox and Yankees single game showdown. That was the first game after we came back from the All-Star break. So a similar, same two teams, single game contest that had pretty similar prize pools overall. Because it was the return to baseball after the All-Star break. So I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail as we did in this video. This has an hour of content, so I definitely recommend checking that out. But for this particular question, let's talk about this a little bit. So it's kind of a little bit slate dependent in terms of how I like to handle my captain spot. The very first thing I will typically do is, well, we can leave those, is I will run what I call my research build, which a lot of you guys are probably familiar with, which is basically just turning correlation and ownership fade off, turning sim variance all the way to 10. So I'm basically just using single game simulations for every lineup, right? And I will run this at a full 1500 build, 1500 lineups, and I will start the build. And what I like to look at here is what the captain exposures look like in basically 1,500 different slate simulations of how this game could play out. And I compare it essentially against the ownership I expect those players to have at that position. The pitchers are going to be definitely preferred in the captain spot in the vast majority of lineups for most games where there are decent pitchers playing, because they are just projected way higher. Their theoretical ceiling is much higher than almost any given batter. They're going to show up a lot, but they may not show up in a way that makes sense for how much they are going to be owned. So the ultimate question here for me is if basically we're seeing that Cole is the optimal captain in 30% of lineups, and Eovaldi's the optimal captain in 23% of lineups. I then want to typically make a determination if I think those players are going to be more or less owned than that number. So if Cole's coming in at, this is actually a little bit higher than I expected, to be completely honest. I was expecting to come in here and say that I was going to fade the pitchers because of this, but if Cole's coming in at 27% ownership, and that actually seems like that might be about right, maybe even up to like about 35. It seems like the field's actually pretty optimally owning that pitcher, and I may just use him at captain and be comfortable with this. But if this number was 20% and the field was going to roster him at 25, 30, 35%, I would probably be more inclined to fade him, because I think there's kind of negative leverage there. The field's over rostering Cole based on his percent likelihood of being the optimal captain player. The other consideration here too is that in baseball, the pitchers are going to be just so highly owned in general. Like they're just going to be much highly owned than any other player most of the time, because you do have to worry about duplication a bit here. One of the easiest things you can do to just decrease the chance of your lineup being duplicated significantly is to make it use any other player besides a pitcher at the captain spot. So the other consideration, let's say you're playing like 60 lineups, is to just come at this from the standpoint of fading the pitchers in the captain spots. And again, just from a pure mathematics standpoint, like the product of these ownerships is going to kind of imply to you that the chance of this lineup being duplicated is way lower than it is than a lineup with Cole at captain. Because this is just you limit suddenly your pool of potential lineups that you can even match to be duplicated is limited to the 3.3% of lineups that even have Rizzo captain, right? So that's another big consideration, because duplication in showdowns in particular is something that we really need to worry about. We need to be focused on, because our EV is going to drop significantly when we are duped. So that's another consideration here. Yeah, I would say on average, so on the average MLB Showdown slate that takes place during the regular season, the contests are pretty small, and I think it in general is just very easy to just roster the pitchers at captains, because it makes sense to do that, and they are often optimal, and you can just go on your way. in these bigger contests for the playoffs, for the wild card games, for the playoffs, and then for the World Series, especially as the contests get bigger, I think you have to start worrying about the duplication a little bit more at that point, right? You can't just necessarily handle things from a leverage standpoint. You need to start thinking about just what's the easiest way to get not duplicated. And I think the builder is not going to recognize the risk of duplication very easily. And I think one of the easiest ways to avoid duplication is to just cross off some of these extremely high owned captain plays and take a shot at any one hitter. That's all on the very much DFS side. On the more baseball side of things, which is a bit more out of my expertise. But I also think there's a strong reason to believe that these guys won't have the same leash that they normally do. Right? I think teams are probably going to be a little bit more likely to rely on their bullpens here in the playoffs. If anybody directly disagrees with me there, or for these particular teams disagrees with me, if you are a Yankees or Red Sox fan that follows these teams and knows these bullpens very well, and I'm off base there, let me know. But I think there's a reason to believe, especially for the wild card game, that these teams may want to preserve some of these guys, run with a tighter starting pitcher rotation anyway. So that's maybe another reason why it actually makes sense to fade some of the pitchers there. Yeah, James also mentioned look into relief pitchers too. You can see bullpen usage might be helpful, get a few Ks. Yeah, so you will often see that some of these relief pitchers will show up in your lineups. That's another thing that is unique about SaberSim overall, is that because we're simulating these games, or we're not just using average raw projections, right? We actually can accurately project relief pitchers. And these guys aren't guaranteed to get in the game, but they have a range of outcomes. And there are game sims where they have a couple strikeouts, get through an inning, and can be pretty valuable. This is something else we talk about in much more detail in this strategy session video. But one of the tools that I like to use for looking into relief pitchers a little bit more is bullpen usage at baseballpress.com. So again, this will show you when these guys last pitched. So obviously there were no baseball games yesterday, so this isn't necessarily a huge concern. But as the playoffs goes on, one of the most useful things you can do is go look and say, for example, for the Yankees, you can see when they last pitched and how many pitches they threw. And that is something that the model will not pick up on very well. So if you are seeing, for example, right, maybe we're later into the playoffs and Matt Barnes threw the day before, you can just remove lineups that include him and tighten up your player pool a little bit more. But this can be another very good way to get different in your lineups and find constructions that are unlikely for other players to use, because these players are often also going to be much lower owned. So. Okay, Eric had a question here. Could you discuss the interaction between the size of the lineup pool and sim variance? I worry increasing the lineup pool increases the effective sim variance. It's an interesting question. So one thing, I mean, the most basic answer here, the first thing that pops to my mind is that your diversity of your lineups is going to increase the more lineups, or the diversity of your player pool is going to increase the more lineups that you have in your pool, simply because you are gaining access to a larger number of game simulations, right? So as you, and it's actually disproportionately so. It's like a multiplicative effect, especially at extremely high levels of sim variance, right? So again, let's go ahead and let's look at this. So we have a 12-game main slate this week for football. And if we're building builds here, and we were using, let's delete stacking rules, and we were using 10 sim variants, right? And we have 500 lineups here. We are basically going to pull a random game simulation for this game and then this game, and then this game, and then this game, and this game once. That's going to be one lineup. Then we're going to do that process 500 times to create the pool of lineups while also tracking correlation and ownership and so on. Now, each individual game sim in that particular case is only going to be used once, and it can be theoretically matched up with any other game simulation for any other game on the slate. Like, there's already a ton of different possibilities that can show up. That's why the variance is so high at sim variance 10. Now, when we increase this to 1500, right? We now are repeating that process 1500 times, right? And again, because each individual lineup is not made from a single NFL game simulation, it's made from a single set of randomly selected 12 game simulations. I'm kind of thinking through this in my head, but that effect of variance is probably multiplicative, and it's probably non-linear. I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not positive about that. This is kind of a pretty sharp question, and like I think probably a little bit of a mathematical question here. But I would say it does make sense that the larger your pool size goes. I guess that's what I'm reading into this with effective sim variance is like you are effectively getting a more diverse pool. If you built 500 lineups here and say so it looked like the builder liked Joe Burrow, right? Say you got 30% of your 500 lineups had Joe Burrow, it would probably make sense to me if when you ran 1,500 lineups, maybe only 20% of your lineups might have Joe Burrow. Because you've introduced so many more additional game simulations in. Interesting. Eric said, last week when I increased pool size, I got more exposure to Mahomes, less diverse it seemed. Let's do a quick test now. Now I'm curious. Let's do default settings for a 150 max. Okay, so 50. So let's do 50 first, or let's do 500 first and let this build. And then let's do 1500 and just see. Less diversity is interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. We'll see what comes out here in the wash. Yeah, I don't know. The other thing I'll note here is that we're simulating each game thousands of times here, and we can't possibly come close to actually giving you a lineup that accounts for every single individual combination of every game on the slate, right? It's just an enormous number. In other words, especially as sim variance is put at higher and higher values, there's going to be additional greater variance in between builds. So while we can maybe get something out of this kind of analysis, there is also just a lot of variance in between the actual individual builds you're getting itself. In other words, if you ran two builds at identical settings with sim variance 10, you may not get the exact same results, or you may get pretty different results in between those two. But first off, highest owned quarterback is Dak Prescott here at 9.4% in 500 lineups, default settings. Now let's look at 1,500 lineups and just see. Curious what we get out of this here. And then after I tackle this question here, I remembered there were two questions that were sent in via support. So I'm going to answer those. And then we will probably make those two questions our last two of the day. Again, tomorrow we'll be doing strategy session. Max will be on. We'll be talking about how to use content and your own research and articles and videos and podcasts and things like that you might be interested in and pull them into your process on SaberSim. And then I will be back doing office hours again on Thursday and Friday of this week. So I'm going to let this build run here. I'm interested in seeing this. What my gut is telling me here is that differences in the exposures between the 500 build and the 1500 build are probably more the variance of the individual sims that are selected for those builds than anything else. But I'm interested to see what this looks like, especially to see if there's like a significant difference. Or Eric, I mean, if you saw like a significant, I would be curious how much more exposure to Mahomes you got when you ran a broader pool size. Was it double? Or I guess double isn't even really valuable because I would be curious if it was a difference of 5% or 10%. But and also, I'm also curious too. I know in your original thing you said I worry increasing the lineup pool size increases the effective sim variance. I would be curious too on what your practical concern is here as well. But we'll give this just another minute or so to finish up building here, and I'm interested to see how it works out. So it was Dak Prescott was our most owned quarterback at 9%, and then it was like Bengals receivers at like 15% were our most owned players. So we did get a little bit more, I guess, exposure to those Bengals receivers. It didn't seem to have a big impact on the quarterbacks overall. Like it seems like it moved around a little bit. I definitely could see it. Like it looks like we did get additional exposure to this big game that it seems like the builder likes at the moment. Let's go back here and look at just overall exposures. Oh, so not a significant difference. I assume what I think is probably happening here is that it is just the natural variance of the builds themselves that is showing up, right? Because again, we're using single game simulations. Each game is simmed thousands of times. The amount of combinations that you can really access, even at 500 or 1500 builds or lineups, is actually pretty low in the grand scheme of things of every individual little combination of games. And I think that the differences you're seeing in these builds is probably variance, but James said, where did Dak go in that second build? He dropped to 7.5%. So we got him in like 9.5 in 500 lineups. We got him in 7.5 in 1500 lineups, which again, I think is just probably mostly just the variance of the builds there, which is another reason why I know people have asked before, like, what if I do a spreadsheet that downloads the exposures and matches them up to ownership and does like a very specific leverage calculation there? That's one of the reasons why I would be curious, or I would be careful doing that kind of thing, because there's just a lot of uncertainty in this number and there's a lot of variance in this number in between builds. But anyway, cool. Let me go ahead and make a quick jump over to these questions that we got in support, and we'll think about starting to wrap this up for today. Eric, feel free to follow up with me too in Slack. Oh, am I back? Somebody give me a heads up in Slack if you can hear me. I was having some internet trouble there. All right, cool. Looks like we are back. Sorry about that. Looks like my internet blinked on me. Not sure where I cut out, but I was saying I'm going to answer this question that came in through support. We'll hit this first. Eric, feel free to follow up with me in Slack once you dig in a little bit deeper there as well. And let's hit this question here. So this one was from Tim. And the question says, where do you start your roster creation for small and large field GPPs if it is different? So where I would recommend starting this process overall is by running test builds at different slider settings based on what makes sense for the individual contest. So when you hit SaberSim, right, you're first looking at the player pool and you go to build your individual lineups. You're going to see a few drop downs here that specify the style. So in this case, probably GPP, the entry limit, whether it is a single entry, a 3 max, a 20 max, and also your total overall entrance here. So this is where it seems like the entry size in particular, small or large field GPPs, is going to be different. And you can see that when we drop down to maybe a single entry, 1,000-person contest, for example, or even lower, we have a different factor of correlation and ownership and upside in the form of sim variance than if we were playing a 150 max large field GPP. These sliders are going to control basically the parameters of how the lineups themselves are built and create different size stacks and different overall total ownership and different exposures to certain plays in multi-entry as well. These sliders are back tested against past contests by running thousands of lineups at every single individual combination of these settings and comparing them to the expected value of how they would have performed in actual contests of these entry limits and entrance sizes accordingly. So these are set at the optimal levels. So what I would do is, if you are interested in just kind of looking to get started and seeing what is viable for certain types of contests, is I would play with what we call test builds at the individual slider settings for the different contests. So run 10 or so lineups for a single entry of 500 people, if that's the contest you're playing. See what those kinds of lineups look like, and then go back and run another build for maybe your large field 150 max big contests and see what those look like. The really nice thing here is that you don't need to worry about setting specific or differing rules for your different contests, whether they're large field or smaller field. We're handling that for you up front, so you can spend your time dialing in and picking the actual individual lineups and players and stacks that you want to. Obviously, a lot more to unpack from there. So if you have any more follow-up questions for me, just feel free to email us back. I'll get you a time-stamped link to this particular recording so you can watch this back. But great question there. And then I did have one other question. This came in from Mike here over the weekend. And he said, I think there's actually a few things to I think there's a few questions to unpack here, but he said, maybe you've already covered this. If you can, point me to a proper video. Could you discuss how you would consider adjusting exposures when creating multiple 3 max or single entry lineups versus when building for 20 max and 150 max? For example, when building 200 plus lineups for larger contests versus building maybe 20 lineups for 3 max or single entries, how spread out do you get for those 3 maxes and single entries? And then do you think it differs by sport? Also, for 3 max and single entries, do you think adjusting exposures are more important for pitchers for baseball and QBs for football? Okay, so yes, definitely a lot to unpack here. So let's go ahead and jump back. So trying to think about how I want to tackle this. It depends on a few different things here. First of all, if you're playing enough 3 max and single entry lineups such that you have 20 unique lineups, it's starting to get to an interesting point. I would say for me in general, I don't often have that many single entries and 3 maxes that I'm playing, or not that many unique lineups. And one thing that I will often do, and I mentioned it here at the start of the stream, is that instead of thinking about exposures, I will actually think about literally the lineups. So I will go through and let's say I have, at 20, it starts to be a lot. Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's not too much, but let's say I have 10. And I will build 10 lineups, and I'll use actually like the 3 max settings. So for football, they're actually a lot more like this. And maybe I'll have 10, right? And I will go here and do this. And so I'll build this. And I guess what I'll actually end up doing is, instead of focusing too much on the exposures, what percentage of 10 lineups do I have a certain quarterback or a certain player, I will actually handle this more from the standpoint of kind of hand picking the individual lineups. And it depends really on when you have, there's two reasons for that. One, when you have fewer lineups overall, I think it's easier to just hand pick your individual lineups by looking at them visually and picking your favorite ones. But also the fewer lineups you have, the less nuance you can express in your exposures, right? So for example, let's say I want to be over the field on Devontae Adams, right? I have really two ways of doing that. Well, let's say I was playing just three lineups. I really only have two ways of doing that, right? I can be approximately twice the field, which is 66%, or I can be approximately 3x the field, right? Which is 100%. There's two discrete points of lineups that I can decide to roster that player in or not. You just have less control the fewer number of lineups you have. So when I'm playing, typically for my single entries and three maxes, if I'm only playing less than 10, a lot of times what I will actually end up doing is literally just unchecking everything, bouncing over to the pool, and just starting to look at these lineups and kind of decide. What I often will do is I will go through and just look at maybe the teams that are stacked or the stack types, and just kind of go in and start to identify sub lineups. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Just some lineups that I like that for one reason or another I want to play. And I'll go in and maybe it's this one and this one and this. And okay, that's starting to be a lot of Burrow. That's starting to be a lot of just this game. Maybe we get a little bit more Dak, right? And I'm kind of just, there's something unique. Kirk Cousins lineup. Keep going, right? And maybe I'm ending up at a pool of lineups that I then narrow down from here. And I'm not super concerned about the actual exposure I'm getting to any one player at this point, but I've kind of picked the individual lineups I want to play. On 150 lineups or even really 20 plus, you're going to hit some point where it's not efficient to spend your time doing it this way. You're also going to hit some point where you have enough overall lineups in your pool that you can be kind of precise and nuanced with your overall exposures. You can be 2x the field on a guy that's 10% owned and actually get 20% exposure while also balancing all of your other exposures. So that's kind of the first thing that popped into my mind when I was looking at this question overall, right? If you have 200 plus unique lineups, you have so much actual individual control over your exposures to dial things in and get as precise as you want that it makes sense to take that approach. But if you only have 10 lineups, 6 lineups, 20 lineups is really on that edge of 3 max or single entries. It may make more sense to take this approach, worry less about what your individual exposure is to any one player and worry more about what the lineups themselves look like and make sure that that you like the way the lineups themselves actually look and are constructed and so on. If you were playing 20 individual 3 max or single entry lineups, and you have 200 lineups for the larger contests, that's just so many unique lineups. At that point, I might just build everything together. If you're literally just personally asking me how I would approach that, at that point, I guess the reason being is that with 20 individual lineups, it's almost too much to take this particular approach. And I think you may just be better off grouping them together and managing all of your exposures to one big pool of 220 or so lineups. If you didn't want to do that, one thing I would consider is treat your set of 3 maxes and single entries as a pool of 20, as a individual 20 max pool, right? Where you're playing a unique lineup in each, and you're kind of treating all of these individual spread out single entries and 3 maxes as if it was a 20 max contest where you just want one to win. That's going to put sim variance at a place on the spectrum that is appropriate for that sized kind of fake contest here. And then you can use your exposures that you are getting from there as kind of a guideline of what is an appropriate amount of exposure to any one player, right? Because again, sim variance is back tested. So where it is set for this hypothetical 20 max contest that represents your entire pool of single entry and 3 maxes, right, will land you at an exposure that is appropriate for this random set of 20 lineups that you're playing. Hopefully that makes sense. But that I think is also a really sound approach. How do I know what an appropriate amount of exposure is to a pool of 20 single entry lineups I'm playing? Well, treat it like a 20 max and ask the builder. So in this case, SaberSim's telling you it is perfectly fine to have 100% ownership to both of these receivers in this game that clearly SaberSim loves at this point in the week. And then ownership kind of scales from there in other positions and players and things like that. So. And then let's see, there was another part of this question here. Then do you think it differs by sport? It probably does. I would allow the different sim variance levels on a per sport basis to help guide you there. So NFL is a high variance sport. You're going to see sim variance even in a relatively small contest is going to be moderate. In baseball, it's probably even a little smaller. In NBA, or a little higher, sorry, because it's even a more variant sport. In NBA, let's look at a past slate that is a little bit bigger. Let's look at, I don't know, January 21st. Oh, 3-gamer. That's not helpful. Mondays are big slates, right? Nope. Fridays are big slates. 11 games. Yeah. So for NBA, sim variance is going to be smaller because it's a lower variance sport. So you're going to get more exposure to the top plays. Right? Sim variance has come down a little bit. So yes, it is dependent on the sport. I would allow the sliders on a per sport basis to help you out there as well. Finally, last question. Do you think adjusting exposures are more important for pitchers for baseball and QBs for football? Not necessarily. Pitchers and QBs are lower variance positions overall in those two sports respectively. What that means is that I think you can feel somewhat more comfortable with, and you will see that the builder, frankly, is more likely to give you more condensed pools of players for those positions because they are lower variance. So just put more generally, at lower variance positions in any given sport, it makes sense to have a more condensed pool. So you will often have more pitchers than you will outfielders in baseball, even accounting for the fact that you play 2 pitchers and 3 outfielders. If you are going to condense your pool intentionally, I would do it at positions that are lower variance, like QB and pitchers. So that is something also that the builder will kind of handle for you a little bit, though. Mike, I'll get you a timestamp recording to this as well. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions for me here on this particular question. Let's look. I'll take one more look here at what Eric followed up here with. 300 divided by 500 is 60%, and 300 divided by 1500 is 20%. Versus today, it was 150 out of 500 equals 30%, and 150 out of 1500 is 10%. So last week, the fraction of the pool that made it into my final lineups was in build 1 was very high and much lower in build 2. So my initial question was wrong. In summary, when you have a smaller pool relative to the lineups you're downloading, when you have a smaller pool relative to the lineups you're downloading, you take out the sim variance is effectively higher. Hopefully this helps others. So my initial question was wrong. Okay, in summary, when you have a smaller pool relative to the lineups you're downloading, the sim variance is effectively higher. Hope this helps others. Okay. Yeah, I am more or less following you here now. Again, I really do still believe that there's a lot of individual variance of which particular set of. Okay, let me put it this way, because then I think we'll be on the same page here. There is a lot of individual variance in any given build of what simulations you happen to grab that you pull into that build. When the total number of lineups you are asking to build is smaller, that variance factor is higher because the effect of each individual, the proportional effect of each individual sim that is grabbed to build a lineup has a greater impact, basically. So you pick some random Chiefs game out of our pool of thousands of Chiefs games that we have, and when you build 500 lineups, that represents 1/500th of your pool, right? But when you build 1,500 lineups, that sim represents 1/1,500th of your pool. So the impact of the variance and the randomness of what individual sims are getting built when you build each individual lineup is much higher the smaller number of lineups you have overall. Like, for example, we could extremely exaggerate this impact by saying, what if we did a build like this, where we did, let's go back to the same default settings, but in this case, we're only going to build 5 lineups, right? Now there's going to be extreme randomness and variance here in what particular 5 lineups we get, because we're only pulling in 5 sims. We could get 100% Kirk Cousins here just on a whim. Like, that could very easily happen. Or we could get, right? This is I think this is going to be the easiest way to see this, right? Okay, so now, like, again, a good example. So we got even quarterbacks, but now we have 60% Devontae Adams, right? Where he was only 20% when we built 1,500 lineups, right? Because again, there's just now a lot of randomness of what individual game sims we're getting when we pull this out. So yes, I think mostly the practical, I would say the practical advice here is probably, if you have the time to do so, to build the full pool of 1,500 lineups for most of your builds. And the higher your sim variance slider is, the more inclined I would be to make your pool size larger. That's actually maybe a very good practical piece of advice here. The higher your sim variance is for any given build, the more likely I would be to make this pool size larger, so as not to artificially over inflate the exposure you have to one particular game or player or stack, just because of the variance of that particular set of game sims where that stack was optimal showing up in your pool more often. Let me know what you think of that, Eric. Curious. I think we're saying the same thing now at this point. It's a little bit hard because I get to use my voice and talk here on stream and talk through it. And I know that you've got to put everything into the chat box and try to explain your thoughts that way. But I think we are kind of saying the same thing here. And there's a pretty sharp observation. That makes a lot of sense to me where we are at now. But anyway, we are going a little bit long here on the stream anyway, so I am going to wrap it up. Happy to follow up on any of these conversations we've had today a little bit more in Slack chat throughout the rest of the day. We will, of course, be back here on Thursday doing another office hours, so happy to pick any of this up here again at 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. Tomorrow will be the strategy session for using the content, articles, videos, podcasts, whatever you are consuming throughout the week to include that into your SaberSim process, how the best ways are to do that. That will actually, I forgot to mention, will be at 4 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, so a little bit later than our normal show. 4 p.m. Eastern tomorrow for that one with me and Max. Otherwise, enjoy the wildcard game tonight. Enjoy your DFS contest if you're playing the Baseball Showdown, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow. See ya.